Hi, everyone. We just opened up the webinar, so we're going to give it about a minute and let people trickle in. But thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited for this conversation, and we'll just give it about a minute. As more people join, I see people are coming on in. Thanks for joining, everyone who just joined. All right, numbers are still increasing, so we'll hang on for just another few seconds here before we jump in. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining. We have a lot of content to get through today, so I will go ahead and kick it off. But I just wanted to, on behalf of Clean Air Task Force and the Brattle Group, extend you a warm welcome to our webinar, Confronting the Grid Crunch, Untapped Solutions to Meet Urgent Load Growth and Overcome Grid and Generation Bottlenecks. I'm Nicole Pavia, Director of the Clean Energy Infrastructure Deployment Program at Clean Air Task Force, and I will be your moderator today. So thanks again for joining us and taking the time. For a little bit of background, as we all know, I think the US power system is in a very transformational moment. Rapid growth, fueled by electrification, data centers, and industrial reshoring, is placing unprecedented pressure on utilities, planners, policymakers, and regulators to serve new loads quickly while balancing affordability, corporate commitments, and state clean energy and climate goals. Scaling up needed infrastructure assets will take time and significant investment and have potential impacts on the rates of existing grid customers. But power sector stakeholders can't wait to address the challenges and the changes inherent in this energy demand conversation. And the challenge requires a wide range of reforms, including long-term market design, transmission planning, and procurement and interconnection process reform. But given the urgency of the challenge, Brattle and Clean Air Task Force felt it would be helpful to identify and collate into a new report near and medium-term options that, one, maximize the value of the existing power system, two, cost-effectively accelerate connection of new loads onto the system, three, improve planning and procurement processes to enable proactive and cost-effective development, and four, offer targeted affordability measures to protect vulnerable customers and mitigate long-term cost risk. The options that we present in our report are actionable and can be added to toolkits today. So on this webinar, we're really excited to share the report findings and hear from a range of our esteemed experts about the steps that utilities, policymakers, and regulators can take, the tools that they have available, and the paths that they plan to go down to future-proof the grid, minimize costs and emissions, drive economic development, and lay the groundwork for an affordable electricity system that can also meet rising demand. So in terms of a run of show, first, I'll turn it over to our colleagues at the Brattle Group, Hannes Pfeifenberger and Long Lam, who will provide an overview of the report findings. And then we will invite our four panelists to a discussion. And I'll quickly introduce them now, but I encourage them to add more to their bios when we get into the questions. So we have Bryn Baker, Senior Director of U.S. Policy at the Clean Energy Buyers Association, John Bernecker, Director of the Transmission Center of Excellence at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, or NYSERDA, Sarah Freeman, Commissioner at the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission, and Kirsten Verklas, Senior Managing Director at the National Association of State Energy Officials. Just one housekeeping note before we get started. There are a couple of ways to engage during the presentation today. You'll see two options at the bottom of your screen. There's a chat box option, which we recommend you use for commentary or support or for direct questions around the report, and the Brattle team will be monitoring that throughout. And then there's the question and answer or Q&A box, which you can put questions to our panelists so I can sort through them more easily. And Hannes, can you just go to the next slide super quickly before we dive in? For those of you not super familiar with Clean Air Task Force, We are a clean energy organization working toward an affordable, zero carbon energy system, and we advocate for policy change, business strategies, and the development of advanced technologies. And you can find out much more about us at catf.us. All right, and with that, I will turn it over to our Brattle colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and welcome to the webinar. As I said, we're going to briefly summarize what's in our report. It's not something we can easily do in 10 minutes because the report is really a reference document with links to, probably 100 different studies in this area. This is a report from us, the authors, but we would like to thank a whole number of people who have been kind enough to review a draft of the report. They're listed here. I won't go through that. But what motivated us to write this report in the first place? It's really, as Nicole said, the US is entering a period of rapid transformational change. We are in it. It's accelerating electrification of buildings and transportation. Electric vehicles have been popular for a few years now. Reshoring of industrial activities. We're having huge manufacturing facilities getting built in different parts of the country. And then, of course, unprecedented surge in demand from data centers, AI, and so on, at the same time that we are facing an aging grid and generation infrastructure, power plants and wires that are approaching their useful life. Now, meeting these challenges will require tremendous amount of investment, not just in grid and generation infrastructure, but also on the customer side, on the distribution side. And making these investments is not only costly, but often takes a long time. And those timeframes are generally too long for fast-moving industries like AI, who wish they could build a data center and get it connected to the grid in the next 12 to 18 months. But it also means that many of these customers are prepared to pay a premium or invest in this infrastructure themselves, bring their own generation to avoid these interconnection delays. But altogether, we do think that the capital likely will exceed the financial capabilities of many utilities. In fact, we are already seeing some utilities being stretched in terms of capital needs. And on top of that, we are getting to a point where affordability challenges and rate impacts on existing customers create some real challenges and regulatory risk. If customers are unhappy because rates are too high, regulators, policymakers will be unhappy, the whole industry will be unhappy. So what is the question? The question is, how can we address these problems more cost effectively? How can we deploy capital more efficiently? And how can utilities, system planners, policymakers, regulators collaborate to serve new loads, bring them on, and serve them cost effectively while meeting state and corporate energy goals, such as reliability and affordability, and in many places, clean energy goals. Many of the data center customers still have clean energy goals, and many of the states still do. Now, just a little bit of background. All of you are probably well familiar with some of these charts. After 20 years of very marginal load growth, we are now looking forward to almost double electricity load over the next 15 years, and certainly adding 20% or so over the next 10 years. Even the next 5 years are very challenging with very steep load growth. This will require investments that have already been increasing. As you can see, we're investing about $50 billion a year in distribution facilities alone, with transmission and production following. So with all these investments and the need to refurbish aging infrastructure, this is a challenge. It can be done, and how this can be done cost effectively and capital efficiently is something we can walk through. And I'll give it over to Long to summarize some of our ideas here.
Thank you, Hannes. So to address the challenges of meeting load growth cost effectively while meeting public policy objectives, we identified a number of solutions, and they can be grouped into four pillars. The first pillar is to maximize the value of our existing power system. Getting more out of the power grid that we already have today is the most cost-effective way to serve new large loads. And this means enhancing demand-side flexibility. This flexibility can come from the new large customers' management of their own electricity usage. It can come from their behind-the-meter and backup generation resources that they already have or will have on site. A third and pretty significant source for demand flexibility comes from other customers in the form of managed electric vehicle charging, smart thermostats, behind the meter solar and storage systems, resources that can be aggregated into virtual power plants and can be used to respond to real power system needs. Dynamic price signals like time of use or even real-time pricing, rate design, they reflect the underlying system conditions, and they have been demonstrated in different settings and contexts across the globe that they can be effective in incentivizing customers to manage their energy usage in a way that is beneficial to the grid. Using grid enhancing technologies such as dynamic line ratings and power flow control can increase the transmission capacity without building new lines. And we need to pursue transmission upsizing and interregional trade optimization. They can help unlock significant capacity at lower cost and faster timelines than greenfield projects would. Many of these solutions are already available today and can be adopted to create more headroom and bring new loads online more quickly and affordably. The second pillar that we include in the report is to cost effectively accelerate new grid connections. So we must streamline and rethink interconnections, especially for new large loads. This means allowing new large customers to self-supply generation and use the grid for backup. But of course, we have to do this without unfairly shifting costs to other customers. Energy parks is an innovative concept that I am particularly excited about. These are large microgrids where generation and load are co-located, and how much energy they inject into or withdraw from the power grid is tightly controlled so that these energy parks would not necessitate network upgrades. Serving new customers quickly will also require us to speed up and streamline generator interconnection processes. The third pillar is to implement proactive planning and procurement processes. Squeezing more out of the existing grid is cost effective. However, it will not be enough to serve the new level of demand that is expected to materialize. We will need new generation and new network capacity in order to do that. However, if we are going to build new capacity, we should do so thoughtfully. For example, we need to implement proactive planning and procurement processes. These processes can help us identify and pursue flexible, least regret solutions. And if and where necessary, they can attract new investments in a timely manner. Proactive planning will also be needed across the sector from generation to transmission to distribution. If and when we need to procure new resources, we should also consider frequent procurement, and we should also streamline the procurement processes and pursue all cost-effective options, including the demand-side solutions. In this high growth environment, it may also be appropriate to revisit the interconnection processes and rate structures to make sure that they reflect the economic and energy policy priorities. For example, in some jurisdictions, there are economic development rates, and it may be appropriate to review these rates in this particular high growth environment. The fourth and final pillar is to introduce targeted affordability measures to protect customers. Implementing the different recommendations that we had laid out in the report will increase the cost effectiveness and timeliness of serving new customers, but targeted affordability measures will likely be needed to help customers mitigate bill increase. And this is especially true for low-income and vulnerable customers. To help these customers, we should consider establishing and expanding energy efficiency and bill assistance programs and provide incentives for these customers to participate in demand-side management programs. And this also means that we need to adopt best practice for large load rate designs to mitigate stranded cost risk and limit shifting costs to existing customers. Throughout the report, we highlight tried and true examples and case studies of how different utilities and system operators across the world have adopted these recommendations, and I highly recommend everyone to take a closer look at the report. Finally, implementing these recommendations will require close coordination and collaboration among a broad set of stakeholders, including regulators, utilities, grid planners, grid operators, and legislators, and others. And we understand that the specific circumstances facing each utility and each grid operator are different, but I hope that the report serves as a menu of options that the industry can reference as we work together to serve new loads in a cost-effective and timely manner while addressing affordability concerns. And with that, I will turn the mic back over to our moderator, Nicole, for the next item on our agenda.
Thank you so much, Hannes and Long, for the overview of the report. That was very informative. And like Long just alluded to, this is going to take a wide range of stakeholders to think very carefully about and to implement. And we are really lucky to have a great representation of some stakeholders here today. And we're going to start off with just a question in response to the presentation that Hannes and Long just gave. Now that we've heard an overview of our findings, I would love to go around and do a little round robin, get everyone's sense of quick reactions to the report. Did any particular takeaways stand out to you? Was there anything missing? Are there key audiences that we should be engaging? Or even areas of future research that are needed on top of what we found in the report? And maybe I will go in order of who I see on my screen. Maybe we'll start with Bryn and go to Sarah, Kirsten, and then John.
Well, sure. Congratulations on the report. It's a pleasure to be here. CEBA, just for context quickly, is a trade association for large energy buyers, collectively with over 33 trillion in market cap. So these are the major companies from manufacturing and data centers to retail and heavy industry driving this grid crunch, but also the solutions to it. And so I think that the key takeaway for me is that we are going to need all of these tools in the toolbox to confront this. But what I love about this report is that it's providing a systematic assessment of all of those tools that we have and how and why to use them. And so from a large load perspective, the four buckets really make sense because our first principle is always we've got to squeeze everything we can out of the system that we've got. Uprates, repowering, advanced transmission technologies. Those are all being actively pursued by large customers already, and we need more of that. We should add transmission intertie optimization to that longstanding recommendation list. That was a bit of a sleeper one in there, but that's been such a longstanding recommendation with huge benefits to power cost reduction. We've got to get interconnection queues moving so that we're actually addressing the resource adequacy crisis because it is all about speed to power, and we need all of these resources contributing. That leads us to planning. Proactive planning is critical because these short-term needs and short-term thinking are really dominating in this environment, but it's long-term, proactive, scenario-based planning processes that are going to get us out and keep us out of emergency operations, given this is a long-term growth trend. So we need to continue to invest in those longer-term processes at the same time. And, Long, you said it, cost is still king. Everything right now is and should be framed in terms of affordability and how it can reduce cost inflation, prevent these cost shifts to existing customers, avoid stranded cost risk. But if we use all of these tools, we can turn the grid crunch into a generational opportunity.
My turn?
Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks. So excited to be with all of you today. It's just an honor to have been included in the conversation. The report was really exciting, and having worked with Hannes, fortunately on several other occasions, it's truly like the practical and pragmatic analysis I expect from you, Hannes. So the points I really wanted to highlight from it. I appreciated the identification of the essential stakeholder groups throughout each section, because, you know, as a regulator, there are always countless opportunities for us, consumer advocates, utilities, all of the other stakeholders, to really work to align our interests in service of the public interest. And the report does a great job of teasing out those possibilities. And it also keeps each stakeholder group in its lane, while still acknowledging that all the lanes are parallel to each other and moving to the same endpoint, right? So often when we think about staying in a lane, it's to the exclusion of other stuff, but I felt this was highly complementary. And then to some of the points Long was making, you know, I was raised to use what you have instead of spending money on the next new thing. So not only do I still drive my 2011 Hyundai Elantra, you know, I got really excited when I saw references to the existing yet sorely underutilized advanced metering infrastructure network that exists all across our country. It's just one of the many tools that Bryn was illuminating, you know, right before I started talking. But it's a great example of using existing tools plus some, you know, time varying rates. We know they work. We know how to implement these to put together an almost cost-free solution that would incentivize more demand side management and increase load flexibility. So those are my two big takeaways. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I work for the National Association of State Energy Officials, NASIO. And so for a way of context, we represent the 56 state energy office directors and staff across the United States, the District of Columbia, and the territories. And NYSERDA, John, is one of our members. So it's great to be here with one of our members. And thank you so much for putting this report together. I just echo what Bryn and Sarah have said. It really highlights, I think, a lot of the things that the states are doing that they can do more of, for sure, and that they're interested in expanding upon. And I really, really appreciate it, in particular, the stakeholder action matrix, because often these reports, they give a lot of thought and then a little less so who can take on that work. And I really appreciate it, that inclusion, and especially the inclusion of the State Energy Office, because I think just as you highlighted sort of those 4 buckets, I don't think we can address any of them without really coordinating across the stakeholder landscape, especially on the state side with the federal agencies as well, and the private sector. And I think the state energy offices in particular play that kind of coordinating and convening role across the states. I also really appreciated kind of that highlighting of technology and planning and policy conjunction, because often you have a report on technologies and then you have a report on planning and policy, and there isn't that kind of connection. So I really appreciated bringing those issues together. I will say, I think one of the challenges for state agencies and state energy offices in particular is this issue of load forecasting, and how really to, like, you know, get your arms around what are we looking at. There's such a wide variety of estimates, and I think there's real concern about affordability and making sure that the investments that are being undertaken are right-sized. What I also really, really appreciated about the report, and it wasn't maybe mentioned in per se, but I think it also, all these kind of suggestions also really highlight the need or could support the enhancement of grid resilience. And I think that's another topic that's sort of overarching, where the states are really interested in figuring out how do we make the grid more resilient, more reliable in light of extreme weather events going forward. So thank you for putting this together.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd also like to thank Brattle and Clean Air Task Force for this report and for the opportunity to join the panel today. As noted, I lead NYSERDA's Transmission Center of Excellence. For a little context there, for those who may not be familiar with NYSERDA, we, along with our partner agencies, administrate New York State's efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, accelerate economic growth, and improve the quality of life for all New Yorkers equitably. And the Transmission Center, I should say, as Kirsten also noted, we serve as New York State Energy Office. The Transmission Center of Excellence within NYSERDA serves as a focal point for transmission, interconnection, and other work related to physical grid issues across the authority's programs, including working with the New York State Department of Public Service, the NYSO, the utilities on broader planning efforts, as well as with our neighboring states on some interregional transmission planning issues. So based on my role and my background as a good grid planner, a number of these recommendations really resonated with me, particularly those around maximizing the value of the existing grid, establishing clean energy and economic development zones, and proactive planning. And particularly because those things both speak to a lot of the work that we have going on here in New York currently, but also provide an opportunity to see some practical examples of how we may continue to approach that work or take new angles or additional actions that we need to do. So, for example, the New York State Public Service Commission currently has a Grid of the Future proceeding, looking at demand side flexibility and how that can be part of the puzzle, as the report notes, on maximizing the value out of our existing system. The state is also engaged in a coordinated grid planning process. It is a forward-looking, scenario-based proactive planning effort. We have the commission also considering the concept of clean energy zones. And beyond that, we are currently in the midst of a state energy plan that is also contemplating a number of these related issues, in which this is very timely in providing some examples to perhaps inform some of our thinking. There's a draft of that plan out already, and we expect to finalize that by the end of the year for anyone following along.
Thank you so much for your input and your initial takes. I think I'm hearing, there's a lot of benefit in seeing options kind of laid out on the table, and also being able to combine different options together, not necessarily, having them all, done separately, or we needing to wait to implement certain solutions. There's a lot on the table right now that I think all of your groups that you represent could take advantage of. I wanted to also take advantage of the fact that we have, customer representatives here, large load customers, as well as the regulator perspective, and just see if Bryn and Sarah, you wouldn't mind weighing in really quickly, even though I know we could talk about each of this topic for the full webinar, about the scale of the challenge that we're facing from, the load perspective and from the ratepayer perspective. And, what are the implications of the challenge that we are facing right now on those particular groups that you interface with, as well as to our broader competitiveness as, an industrial nation and trying to build up and reshore industry. Maybe we can start with Sarah this time and then go to Bryn.
Sure, happy to. I mean, it's just the age-old tension, right, between resource adequacy and affordability, just writ larger than ever. I mean, you asked about scale. It's pretty massive. Even when the numbers we see have gone from purely speculative to mildly speculative to I'm pretty darn sure this is going to happen, the order of magnitude is still, so much bigger than anything we've seen, in any of our careers, really. We've been slow and steady or slow and just slow for so long. As a regulator, we're always talking about balancing those interests. And right now, for valid reasons, I feel like the pendulum has swung pretty clearly over to the reliability, resource adequacy side of the equation, especially in a vertically integrated state like Indiana, where our utilities, the utilities have an obligation to serve their customers. This isn't an option that they're given once somebody moves into their jurisdiction. So this isn't being done to the exclusion of affordability. Everybody is, without a doubt, from the utilities to the regulators to elected officials to the large load customers themselves, truly very concerned about affordability. But it feels more right now that we're just doing what we can to mitigate or minimize the pace of the burden on rates. And over time, I'm sure we're going to do better and better, but we're going to see a lot of trial, but hopefully not a lot of error along the way as we try different techniques and hopefully implement a lot of what is in the report, not to sound like too much of a sales pitch. Bryn's going to have a great perspective, I know, on the competitiveness issue, and I look forward to hearing from you on that. I just want to say, as a regulator, it's really interesting to me because the decisions we make in these proceedings when they come before us, they're the critical component in ensuring, state, regional, national competitiveness. But we don't, nor have we had a say at all in whether it's a race we think we should be participating in, even though we can make or break the outcome. And the choices we make are having huge impacts on wallets and energy burdens. So that part of the equation is pretty tough to figure out for me. But I rely on the scope of my decision making, in order to do what is in the public interest here in Indiana. So, Bryn, I'll turn it over to you, and I'm curious to hear you.
Well, and you are at the intersection of all of these things and the toughest job possible. But I will sort of maybe from the customer side of this zoom out and then in a bit. I mean, I do think it's hard to overstate what is at stake in all of this, because to be able to compete globally, to grow the economy nationally, to think about how do you really innovate and deliver new jobs locally, like we need to be able to connect these new loads without blowing up everybody's bills. To avoid sounding overly dramatic, maybe I'll quote the CEO of PJM, who recently said, "Whoever controls AI technology is going to control the new world order." I don't think too many Americans really want the result where we lose the AI race, whether we like that the race is happening or not. But we have to recognize that data centers, AI or otherwise, traditional, they power the modern economy. We all want our phones to work, hospitals to be up and running. We don't want to have to pay cash at the grocery store, so we need data centers. It's also about new manufacturing facilities that mean new good jobs. So let's first remember what we're chasing, and that those economic benefits and our overall competitiveness depend on growing the grid most cost efficiently. So in terms of implications to existing customers, I mean, obviously the implications here are enormous, but let's also remember, what are the biggest factors making power bills sort of the new price of eggs? You all said it in the report. Distribution charges have increased 160%. Transmission costs have tripled. I think it's another Brattle stat that says 90% of that transmission being added is from local, not these more cost-efficient regional lines. Congestion costs have doubled. We've got all the backlogged interconnection. Those are all costs that are linked to the lack of long-term proactive planning. You've also got storm and wildlife hardening and recovery, natural gas prices that increased from the Ukraine war, supply chain costs now compounded by tariffs like that. Let's just remember that those are the things driving bills up, not the existence of new loads trying to connect to the system. So what are the things that can drive bills down? Solar and wind have driven wholesale prices down in most regions of the country. The report talks about weatherization, energy efficiency, demand response, incentivizing load flexibility. As Commissioner Freeman said, tariff design is really critical here, and planning transmission the right way, bigger, fewer lines at the regional level instead of these more and costlier ones at the local level. I think it's really critical to remember how transmission defines the constraints and the costs on who can interconnect. It makes the capacity markets where they exist. So that's a really fundamental economic and grid priority, not just a clean energy priority. And so as we build this next wave of economic development, if we raise bills for everyone, we're doing it wrong. there are a lot of options to avoid that overall. And I think that's what this effort is about, focusing on.
No, these are very insightful points. Thank you both for weighing in on that. There's a question in the chat that got me thinking too about how I don't envy anyone who's doing load forecasting, especially with the utilities. It is a very uncertain time, of course. And I think, Bryn, your point also alludes to my next question, which is like, okay, we have all of this infrastructure that we have not really planned or invested in, which is driving, some of the cost increases that we're seeing. I'd love to talk a little bit about some technologies to increase the efficiency of the grid. We've alluded to some advanced transmission technologies, GETs. These are very hot topics right now, and I'm sure people would love to hear more about them. So maybe we'll turn to our state representatives here, Kirsten and John. I'm curious from your perspectives how state officials are thinking about boosting the existing grid, and if you have any examples from your experiences either in New York or looking at a more national view of state actions. How do they view tools like GETS? And especially within conversations around the transmission system, do they supplant investment or do they boost investment? Are they like how do they interact with the existing grid? And are there any other tools available at our disposal to get more near-term wins out of the grid? Does anybody want to start?
Yeah,
All right, John, we'll start with you.
happy to start with maybe the New York context and let Kirsten take it more broad. So within New York, we're very supportive of the deployment of GETs and other technologies that both reduce costs for consumers, but also can serve as bridges to longer term solutions to allow both load and resources to interconnect in a more timely fashion. So some examples of that state support are through that coordinated grid planning process that I referenced in my introduction. There's actually a requirement from the Public Service Commission that the utilities within New York State consider grid enhancing technologies as they develop their local solutions as part of that long-term proactive planning effort. And also in support of that, because some of what we refer to as GETs are really more underutilized technologies that have been around for a while, but some are truly new and more emerging. The state has also established an advanced technology working group where utilities can work together with support from the state on learning more about the implementation of some of these grid enhancing technologies and techniques to more appropriately incorporate them into their planning analyses. And that is set up to feed back into the coordinated grid planning process itself. And I think in terms of other opportunities that exist, I think with GETs themselves, at least with a subset of them, especially as bridging technologies, there probably needs to be a little bit more work on innovation in the regulatory space relative to how they're cost recovered. Because I think there's a challenge in many jurisdictions with this concept that I might put something in place in one area of the grid and leave it there for a few years as a bridge to a longer term solution, and then move it elsewhere, and then move it elsewhere. And that doesn't fit really neatly into, historical rate of return constructs for utilities. And there's also in some regions, but not in all, the need maybe to think about how to mitigate the perverse incentive relative to increased capital expenditure from utilities. If there truly are large cost savings from it, how can that rate structure be, thought of a little bit differently to reduce that incentive? And then, of course, beyond those, other opportunities are always not just using GETs and advanced transmission technologies play into this, but really how do we right size, not just upsize, but also right size thinking ahead our existing system, and those technologies play a role in that thinking as well.
Yeah, so I think there's huge interest on the state energy office and stateside in how we can get more efficiency out of the existing system, and that certainly includes GETS. I think over the last year, there's been increased attention by the state energy offices, and a number of states have passed legislation that requires utilities to look at GATS, or that, enables public utility commissions or state energy offices or both to implement working groups or look at reports that can sort of outline for each state how they can use GETS more efficiently, or how we can implement that more efficiently. On the NASIO side, we've actually put together a NASIO policy in a box that looks at a lot of examples from the states, how state energy offices, states in general, have implemented legislation. There's lots of examples. I'll pick a few. For example, in Utah, the state energy office has coordinated with the governor and the state legislature and made sure and worked on passing a law this year to look at the cost effectiveness analysis, just what John said, the issue of, how do we pay for it, and making sure that is hurdle and barrier is overcome. And so there's a close coordination a lot of times by the state energy offices and the state legislatures on how to, making sure that the policy frameworks, the bills are there for utilities and public utility commissions to look at these technologies. I will also say that in a lot of states, what I've seen being done very successfully, both on the GET side, but more broadly, is the implementation of working groups. So a lot of times I think we, look at IOUs, we look at procedures at the PUC without maybe taking a step back and saying, well, maybe it would be good to have a working group first, or have sort of a coordination and conversation, a workshop with all the stakeholders prior to going into a proceeding. Because I also want to make sure we don't forget, the munis and co-ops in the utility landscape that aren't regulated in most states by the PUCs. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity on the state side to implement working groups and really kind of think through for each state what that looks like. In Massachusetts, for example, the state energy office co-chaired the Clean Energy Transmission Working Group. And so they brought the private and public sector stakeholders together and did a report on what kind of necessary transmission infrastructure upgrades there should be. And so that includes also advanced transmission technologies, et cetera. So I think that is really a unique opportunity for the state energy offices. I will also say that when it comes to additional technologies, I think one of the key kind of points that the state energy offices look a lot at is like, how do we automate a lot of these processes? And so they look maybe more towards the distribution side, but thinking about automated load management and how do we kind of increase the visibility into the grid that enables some of these processes. Because I think we all recognize, like on the efficiency side, the more it is automated, the better chance we have to really implement some of these. If we're asked to, turn on our washing machine at 3 a.m., that's probably not going to be as successful as if there's an automation component to it. And then finally, looking a little bit at sort of the planning too, I wanted to highlight that together with NERUC, NASIO has been doing a lot of work on comprehensive electricity planning. We did a big task force that culminated in 2021 that looked at how do we integrate resource planning and generation, transmission planning and distribution planning, and how do we connect all those dots? Because, we are still very much in silos. And so bringing that together and as the report mentions, doing that more holistically would really benefit us. And so we are currently reprising that effort with an eye towards load growth and really understanding how do we make sure that these planning processes meet the current challenges. And so a lot of the states took the roadmaps that we developed in the first go around, for example, Maryland and Maine, and they implemented them into legislation. And it really is impressive to see how a lot of these states are thinking holistically about planning processes and really trying to make sure that the dots are connected and we're not thinking about each of these three buckets and silos anymore.
Very, very actionable answers from you both. Thank you. Just to quickly repeat some things that I heard. Considering cost recovery for GETs and other similar technologies, thinking about right-sizing systems, not necessarily just building, considering for the states policies in a box and allowing states to learn from each other, working groups to incorporate all stakeholder input and automation. So yeah, really, really tangible things that people on this webinar can take away. Thank you so much. And Kirsten, your last point pivots perfectly into our next question, and I see also reflected in the Q&A from Jeff. So Jeff, we're on the same wavelength. We wanted to turn to planning. And this is, I think, a really, really important, but also very complex piece of what we're discussing. A lot of times when you think about planning, there are 10-year, 20-year, 30-year, 50-year planning cycles. And I think what this report kind of emphasizes is that you can start integrating some of these nearer term solutions into planning exercises, and that will have, benefits and implications on, what needs to be done in those longer timeframes. So I just wanted to ask if anybody has an example of Jeff says, a utility, a regulatory body, or if there are any other types of planning exercises that have done a particularly good job of thinking holistically and balancing that near-term and long-term outlook. If anybody wants to jump in, please feel free.
I could maybe start with an example. I know Jeff talked about US utility, but the best example I've actually seen of a good planning process that explicitly recognizes uncertainty and develops least regret solutions that work in both the near term and the long term is actually in Australia, the Australian Electric System Operator, and their planning process, which they call integrated system planning process, is a scenario-based process that develops solutions that work robustly across all scenarios, which is putting a premium on flexible solutions. That means solutions, things like building a line that's operated initially at lower voltage, a single circuit line that's built on double circuit towers that you can step up the voltage, increase capacity, and then add a second circuit later on. Texas, when they developed the CREST project, have done that, for example. They've built most of the lines as single circuit lines with double circuit towers. And by now, almost every one of these lines has a second circuit on it already. So you size the solution for the near-term needs while paying a little bit extra to make the solution more flexible and allow it to expand as necessary. CalISO has done something similar with a solution to integrate offshore wind in the North Coast, not knowing is it going to be 1,600 megawatts or 3,000 megawatts or 8,000 megawatts. So they came up with a solution that initially builds two 500 kV lines, where one of the lines is ready to be HVDC ready. So adding converter stations on either end of the line can get you from 1,600 through to 3,000 megawatts without pre-building it and then having overbuilt the solution. And that HVDC ready line would be built on enough right-of-way to put a second line on that would ultimately allow you to get to 8,000 megawatts. And the Australians do look at near-term versus longer-term needs. They might identify near-term projects right away, approve them. They might identify projects that are not needed right away, but will likely be needed soon. For these projects, they might authorize doing all the permitting, but then wait with the construction authorization until the need is more certain. So these are some examples that I would point out.
That's great, Hannes. Does anybody else want to weigh in with an example? No pressure. Okay, cool.
I mean, I guess there are certain, I would say probably no region's getting an A across all of the categories, but I do think MISO deserves some credit for leading what's possible when you do long-term proactive scenario-based planning for transmission. And I think that that has shown that you can identify significant benefits. Now, granted, we all know that there's some challenges to the approach, but the 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 intent of identifying long-term needs and solutions that meet those needs that ultimately result in greater benefits than if you do this in a short-term siloed approach, I think has proven out there. And now we're trying to figure out how to do that across the country, and we're in growing pains because there's a lot of moving pieces here. But there's bright spots in a number of different places, I would say.
Yeah, Bryn, I would second that. What I particularly like about the MISO approach is that they consolidate drivers. They figure out how much generation do they need to interconnect, how much load do they need to serve, what are the reliability needs, and then creating a portfolio of projects that is really a multi-value portfolio that can address multiple needs at the same time. And what we are seeing, things like the joint interconnection queue process that MISO and SVP have done, when you plan more holistically, the solutions tend to be lower cost on a dollar per megawatt basis. So we can actually reduce costs by planning more holistically. And talking about noteworthy examples, part of the challenge with the grid planning is that it's very siloed with a planning for local needs, for regional reliability needs, for economic needs, for public policy needs. And the more you chop up these planning process into silos, the less likely you are to find more cost-effective at-scale solutions. And what SVP is currently doing, it's consolidating all its individual grid planning process into a single consolidated planning process, or CPP, because we do need another acronym every once in a while in this industry.
And if I could, I mean, just to sort of tack on to that, because I think another key piece of what's informing all of this long-term planning, it starts with load forecasts. And so this gets to, I think, a couple of questions in the Q&A, because it does all start with, what is your load forecast? What are you planning for? And I think we've already said it. The one thing you can say for sure about them is that they're wrong. So from our perspective, applying some discipline to identify serious load interconnection requests is critical to start with. That's things like posting collateral requirements, project milestones, and that if you meet those requirements, that dictates what gets, or maybe who gets counted in a load forecast that you then use to plan and approve infrastructure decisions going forward. There's also a few examples of how different regions are trying to tighten up the requirements around load interconnection requests and through rate designs. Ohio and Indiana tariffs. I think there's actually a few others profiled in the report. Commissioner Freeman could probably talk about the Indiana one. And with minimal exceptions, you generally haven't seen large loads up and leave because of tightening the requirements. They need power. Their decisions are made on where they can get it. And so we just have to keep that in mind, that applying more discipline to the load forecast is going to result in better planning. And Kirsten, I think you sort of said it, like we also just need to bring all these threads together. And I thought it was interesting that last week Commissioner Chang at FERC had a great op-ed arguing that we need to integrate transmission and generation interconnection processes to meet load growth. It just makes a lot of sense that we should plan parts of the same system in silos.
This has been really fantastic. Thank you for sharing so many specific examples. I think it's really helpful for people to take away. If there are no other comments on that question, we could pivot over to what I think everyone has kind of alluded to one way or another. And there's a question in the chat as well about affordability. This is obviously a really, really, really important piece of the puzzle here. And there's a question in the chat that alludes to, the burden of the energy transition can fall on, low-income customers and others with limited ability to absorb those extra costs. And so I think I know that's something that all of you are very actively thinking about in your work. I think maybe I would turn this question to maybe Sarah and John from the state's perspective, but are there any targeted affordability measures that you've seen implemented or have them implemented in, a state or utility area that has started to chip away at some of these ratepayer impacts, or anything that you might propose be done in the future?
I can go ahead and talk a little bit about what we're seeing in Indiana. With respect to the forthcoming, large load influx, the tools that we have that we've created that have been enacted legislatively and given to us are still nascent, so we haven't seen them play out yet. The Indiana Michigan AEP tariff that we approved is very nicely highlighted and covered in the report itself. So look there for a lot of information about it. A lot of the components that were addressed towards affordability concerns that were part of that tariff approval also were enacted into laws that took effect on July 1 of this year. The 80% requirement that large load customers pay at least 80% of their reasonably allocable costs. The financial assurances and collateral requirements that kick in if a large load customer doesn't follow through on something, as well as mandatory consideration by the utility and the large load customer of self-generation, demand side management, and GATS as well to minimize costs and protect ratepayers. So the approach Indiana's taking to date is definitely ring fencing around the existing customer base and tried to isolate as many costs and as much risk as possible to the large load customer. We also just approved the creation of a deregulated generation only affiliate of one of our investor owned utilities. So, and again, there was a lot of ring fencing language in there to isolate and protect the ratepayers. And that's still pending because the appeal window is still open. So I'll leave it there. We also have a petition before us that filed jointly with Indiana, Michigan, our AEP affiliate, and Google, their large load customer. That includes a demand response offering that's tailored to Google's business capabilities. The goal there is to reduce the utilities' capacity obligation and transmission requirements to further benefit their existing customers. And then I guess the final thing that we're seeing here, we just completed a study on performance-based rate making, and then we'll be working with the legislature to put in some of the recommendations from that report, put those into practice over the next few years. The two things that were recommended by the study for us were implementation of forecasted multi-year rate plans plus various performance incentive mechanisms. So it'll be interesting to watch and see how that progresses. So mostly it's a work in progress. And my final comment is I'm really happy that we're not just seeing the same thing repeated over and over. Our utilities are trying different approaches, and I feel that they're tailoring what they're proposing to what they know about their existing and their future customer base.
Thank you. And yeah, John or Kirsten, with the last couple of minutes left, do you want to just give a quick response?
I think just adding on, because I think Sarah covered a lot of ground on some of the ideas in terms of targeted programs. I think obviously, here in New York, as everywhere, affordability is really at the forefront of the conversation. And it is, one of the key tenets of this draft state energy plan that we're currently looking at. So beyond some of those targeted program ideas under consideration or already implemented, it's really about strategic investments, right? Because we need to look at ways that we can ensure that our energy systems can reliably meet demand at reasonable cost. And that requires planning and investments across multiple possible futures, as we've discussed throughout this webinar. And as part of that, we actually looked at an affordability analysis as part of this draft state energy plan, and found that investing in some energy saving measures, such as building weatherization, efficient appliances, equipment, fuel efficient electric vehicles, transit use, etc., in many cases lead in the long term to larger reductions in energy bills than ones that just switch to, newer versions of legacy equipment. And so, again, in addition to those targeted efforts for the near term, those strategic investments in the longer term are the way that we're going to get bills trending, not just increasing as much, but perhaps trending down in the long term.
Thank you. Kirsten, 30 seconds. You want to chime in really quick and then we'll wrap?
I wanted to say that, yes, affordability is a huge topic for the state energy offices, of course. But I also think we need to look at kind of bill impacts across a lot of utilities, not just the electricity sector. We also need to think about tax revenue. And I just wanted to highlight in West Virginia, there was a bill passed this year on how tax revenues associated with data centers can be divvied up. So it goes to some of the local communities, it goes to other communities that did not get the data center, it goes to some state funds for grid reliability, and then it goes to the personal income tax reduction fund. So I think there's lots of different options to also potentially use some of the tax revenue from data centers and other large loads to help mitigate some of the impacts on the bills.
That's a fantastic note to end on. Thank you all so much. I just want to extend a thank you to our Brattle colleagues and also our illustrious panel here today. Thank you so much for your very concrete insights, and we really appreciate your time. If you have any other questions that we didn't get to today, please feel free to reach out to the Brattle group or CATF folks, and we can try to get you the answers that you are looking for. But with that, have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much again for joining. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.